Hello, my name is Kathrine Mortimore. I'm the author of Disciplinary Literacy and Explicit Vocabulary Teaching, and I'm here to talk to you about the importance of explicit vocabulary teaching in narrowing attainment gaps, something that I feel particularly passionate about. So I'm going to start by sharing with you a quotation which was initially shared with me around 10 years ago now by Jeff Barton as part of a course that I was undertaking at the time. So Jeff was particularly inspirational in explaining the connection between educational disadvantage and literacy, and also how those gaps can enhance and develop over time. So he shared with us, with the particular course, this idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So the Matthew effect, if you like, and how that Matthew effect can be applied to literacy, particularly in relation to vocabulary. So children who fail at early reading begin to dislike reading. And this leads to what we call the cumulative disadvantage phenomenon. So they don't expand their vocabularies and their background knowledge. Their limited vocabularies then interfere with their comprehension. They don't understand what they're reading. They don't know the words that appear within the books. Their limited comprehension then contributes to their reading failure, and they read less than their peers who are stronger readers. So at the same time as having a cumulative disadvantage phenomenon, you also have a cumulative advantage phenomenon. So you have the reverse effect going on for those students who enjoy reading. So they're enjoying reading, they like it because they're good at it, they expand their vocabularies, and they're more likely to be able to comprehend what it is that they're reading. They'll get better and better at reading and stronger in comparison to their peers who are weaker, and they'll perceive themselves as being stronger readers, and the children who started off finding reading difficult will perceive themselves as struggling readers. And that obviously impacts on their ability to access the entire curriculum. But it's not just the job of English teachers to improve students' vocabulary. It's something that can be done across the curriculum, and it's particularly important that in every subject we have a strategy that will help us to enhance our students' vocabulary. So I'm just going to share with you an activity that was done by the Educational Endowment Foundation many years ago, when they were first illustrating this idea of what it's like to be a student with a limited range of vocabulary. And I found this quite profound when I went through this experience. So these are all very common sayings. And we found that our scientists were particularly good actually at working out what they mean. So very familiar, well-known sayings, but using much more advanced vocabulary than many of us are familiar with. So, for example, compute not your immature gallinations prior to the puncture of their brittle epidermis. Took me a little while to work this one out. So don't count your chickens before they hatch. Cleave gaminous matter for fodder during the period in which the orb of the day is refulgent. Make hay when while the sun shines. Finally, every substance which coruscates is not fashioned from aureate material. All that glitters is not gold. So if we're looking at getting staff buy-in into a particular vocabulary project that you might be starting, this is a really good activity to just illustrate to staff what it's like to be in that position, because it can be quite difficult if we've always been kind of strong readers to anticipate what it must be like for our students who are further behind. So I found that particularly impactful. Okay, so there's two main considerations that we're going to look at throughout this presentation. The first is curriculum, and the second is pedagogy. So within curriculum, we're looking first of all at the selection of vocabulary that will have the highest leverage. So those words that are most likely to allow students to engage with a higher level discussion of key concepts within their extended writing. Also, how we might sequence the teaching of that vocabulary within the curriculum. So which vocabulary is more foundational and must be taught fast, which vocabulary is that vocabulary that must be, that builds upon those foundational terms, that's perhaps more complex and requires previous knowledge in order to access. Finally, as far as curriculum is concerned, the retrieval of that vocabulary over time. How can it be circled back over? Lots of really great vocabulary initiatives begin with the best of intentions. So word of the week delivered by tutor, for example, that certainly helps to support in students' vocabulary acquisition. But because it's divorced from the curriculum, often students, particularly our weaker readers, really struggle to retain the vocabulary concepts that they're being taught. So in my view, it's particularly important that if we are going to introduce vocabulary terms, that we also have time and space to revisit those vocabulary terms to make sure that they are fully embedded. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about that. Okay, so as far as pedagogy is concerned, how will new vocabulary be introduced in the lesson, and what steps should be followed to ensure that they're introduced thoroughly so that they stick? And I'm going to spend some time talking about strategies that Doug Lemov talks about within Reading Reconsidered, and Becca L. talk about within Bringing Words to Life, two seminal texts that I would thoroughly recommend that you read, alongside, of course, Alex Quigley's Closing the Vocabulary Closing the Vocabulary Gap. Really, really influential text that I would strongly recommend that you look to for further reading on vocabulary. Secondly, within pedagogy, what strategies and techniques can we use within the lesson itself in order to circle back over previously taught terms, again, to ensure that they're embedded and they're remembered? Okay, so as far as selecting that vocabulary is concerned, and thinking about those highest leverage terms, just give you a couple of examples of terms that we might be kind of tempted to think are particularly key and spend a lot of time over, but actually how those terms might not be the most useful. So suffragette, for example, is a factual term that could be explained quite briefly as part of the teaching of historical context. Let's say that we're teaching an Inspector Calls, for example, and we're looking at the suffragette movement in relation to the character of Sheila. But I wouldn't pick suffragette as being one of our key vocabulary terms. Rather, I would pick something like emancipation. That's a potentially more useful and adaptable analytical term that will allow students to gain a more authoritative voice within their writing. And it's also a term that's more flexible because it can be introduced perhaps at Key Stage 3 when looking at some other texts that look at the idea of gaining political freedoms. And then by the time they come on to study an Inspector Calls, they will have been introduced to that idea of emancipation in a variety of contexts. So when it comes to applying it to the character of Sheila, it can be much more straightforward, particularly for our weaker readers who've seen that term time and again across the curriculum. So that's a term that's quite, ironically, quite empowering for students to learn early on, and they'll feel much more confident about using it then within their writing. So thinking about sequencing and the sequencing of vocabulary particularly, and those foundational terms and those that build on previous knowledge. Well, what it can be very useful to do is look particularly at Key Stage 4 and the terms that are going to be most useful to allow students to write authoritatively within your subject areas at Key Stage 4. And those are the terms that are the explicitly taught terms then at Key Stage 3. So it's not that other terms aren't taught at Key Stage 3, of course, but these are the terms that we really foreground and spend the most amount of time over within class, and they're the terms that we might, as I'm going to come on to look at with retrieval, those are the ones that we place within knowledge organisers, and that we ensure that students are learning for homework. So, for example, within history, there's going to be a huge amount of factual terms that apply only to each discrete unit, and obviously students need to learn those in order to be able to write about them within those units. But if we're thinking about those terms that we want students to be confident about taking forward into Key Stage 4, an example might be the term insurgency, that actually you spend a bit more time in a particular Key Stage 3 unit learning that term, because that allows them to write authoritatively about the historical situations that they're discussing. And that term can then be transferable, depending obviously on the units of work that are studied at Key Stage 4, and will allow them to write authoritatively later on, because they're very familiar with that term and they've practiced it and used it in a variety of different contexts. So I'll give you some examples of how we at our school at Torquay Academy use retrieval practice for vocabulary. So we have knowledge organisers. That's something that's become quite popular. I know Michaela School several years ago now gave me the inspiration and my head teacher inspiration to bring those into our context. And they really helped us to think about our curriculum as well. So really pinning down what are the key conceptual, the key concepts that students need to learn, and the key vocabulary that students need to learn that can be contained within the knowledge organisers, that links very closely with what students are doing for homework and that students are learning within class. So I've put here to have a centralised homework schedule. So our homework schedule links to our knowledge organisers, but also links to our online homework and quizzing programmes like Tassamai and Bedrock. I've set up specifically to help students learn key concepts within each of their subject areas, but particularly vocabulary. And we've used Tassamai, and I know Bedrock is set up to do this as well, to look particularly at the etymology of words and breaking the words down, so that when students do come across unfamiliar words, they're equipped with those tools that they can use to break the words down into their component parts. Again, I've mentioned this idea of centralised planning and the low stakes quizzing that can take place within lessons. I think particularly if you're in a context where you have a large number of students who are disadvantaged, a large number of students who struggle with their literacy, these are also students who are likely to struggle with carrying out homework tasks and perhaps see the point in homework tasks. And we've certainly found that having a centralised whole school policy in relation to homework and all students carrying out the same tasks on the same night and on the same day really helps to reinforce the importance of it, that we value it, and that it's so strongly linked and intertwined with our curriculum that students really see that carrying out their homework, learning their knowledge organisers, carrying out their online quizzing really does support their learning within lessons. And so they're more likely to engage with it. Not saying it works for every single student, but it's certainly, we've got a very, very high proportion of students who undertake this centralised homework system. So having these vocabulary banks to draw upon for extended writing tasks is particularly important. So some schools, we certainly use workbooks. I know some schools use booklets. And these can be really perfect for planning out in advance when carrying out extended written tasks, where these vocabulary banks can appear. And particularly early on in a unit of work, obviously this scaffolding can be removed over time, but it's very difficult for students with lower literacy skills to produce extended written tasks if they don't have access to those key vocabulary terms that they need to be using. This is slightly different from glossaries and dictionaries, which span across across units of work and even across key stages. For example, we have put together a whole school dictionary, which we've called our TA dictionary, which has all of the key terms that students will encounter between Key Stage 3 all the way up to Key Stage 4, and it allows students to make links. We've mentioned etymology before. The dictionary breaks down the etymology of every single word, so they can really see the connection between some of the words that they're learning in science and the words that they're learning in history, for example. They can also see where the same word comes up in multiple subjects but has slightly different meanings and nuanced meanings. So, for example, linear comes up in science, it comes up in art, and it also comes up in maths. But in each of those subjects, it means something slightly different. And that's where the dictionary can be really useful for them to look up those terms and see how they differ from subject to subject. Okay, so moving on to pedagogy, and as I said, I've been heavily influenced by Reading Reconsidered and bringing words to life in putting this together in terms of the steps that are really useful for students, particularly our weaker students, in learning new vocabulary and ensuring that it's embedded. So providing student-friendly definitions that avoid oversimplification. It can be quite tempting when introducing new terms to say, well, using the synonym model, this word, oh, it means this, but it doesn't mean that. It means similar to that, but actually you're reducing the level of understanding of the student by oversimplifying the definition. So it's really important that they're provided with a very clear definition that has vocabulary that the student is likely to understand, but makes very clear that it's not the same as another word. So that term then needs to be modelled using various contexts, ideally linking backwards in the curriculum. So using that insurgency term, for example, if that's introduced, let's say at the end of year 8, perhaps they could look back over previous units of work that they've studied, and the teacher could model using that term, linking back to those different historical situations that they've encountered previously. Adding a visual illustration can be particularly useful when asking students to explain in a sentence how the new term applies to the image that's been chosen. I've mentioned that synonym model before. It's useful to provide synonyms and explaining how the term is similar to another term, but it's also important that it's pointed out how the word is different from that other term too. And I've mentioned etymology already. So when introducing new terms, it's really useful to break down the prefix, the root, the suffix of the word, and make connections between those and terms that they have already encountered, a more kind of straightforward, everyday language that uses the component parts. And that will help students when they're encountering unfamiliar vocabulary to be able to just break down the word into that prefix, root, suffix, and see, actually, I haven't encountered this term before, but I know what this part of the word means. So that gives me a clue in the context as to what that word means. Okay, so within lessons, we obviously are going to be wanting to look at particular techniques that help us to revisit vocabulary. So the first slide was obviously looking at how we introduce a new term in the first instance, but obviously we need to revisit terms over time. So linking in with homework, 5-a-day retrieval tasks right at the very start of a lesson can be a really nice kind of confidence boost, and also reinforces the importance of the homework to carry out those retrieval activities. So 5 questions which draw on vocabulary and key concepts that have been taught within that unit, but also that link back over previous units where they are those highest leverage terms that we've identified that we want students to carry through with them across their learning journey. Providing word banks of previously taught terms which link to written and oral tasks. So I've talked about extended writing. But it can be really important when in speaking and listening activities that students are also provided with word banks, not just of terms that apply to that particular unit, but also link back to previous units, and so that they can see the connections between them and have that word bank there to help facilitate their discussions, and also allow them to test out saying the words in a less threatening environment, perhaps in a paired talk, rather than in a whole class discussion. Making conceptual links between talk content through revisiting vocabulary in new contexts. So this is what I was talking about within the 5-a-day, but obviously within the lesson itself and the teacher exposition, there are going to be opportunities to utilise previously taught vocabulary in order to bring to life new concepts as they're being taught and introduced within lessons. Okay, I hope you found that useful. As I said, I have written a book which incorporates explicit vocabulary teaching section. So please feel free to take a look at that if you'd like some more ideas. Thank you very much for listening.